Hey everybody, this is part 3 of the Socio-Economic Nature of the USSR by Antonio Carlo. Section 3 is titled, The 1965 to 1966 Reforms, Where is the USSR Going? Section 1, Industrial Reforms from 1956 to 1965. We have seen that serious tensions have developed in the USSR which are not resolvable within the system and which entail either a socialist or a capitalist solution. Karan and Mogilevsky's, quote, technocratic, end quote, alternative is no real alternative since their, quote, socialism, end quote, i.e. an economy directed by managers based on the Yugoslav model is nothing but capitalism, since the laws that regulate it are substantially those of the capitalist system. What is typical of capitalism is the production for profit. This is true even if the system lacks some relevant legal characteristics, such as the hereditary transfer of ownership of the means of production, something that has not yet been restored in Yugoslavia. Footnote: in Eastern Europe, including Russia and Yugoslavia, the right of inheritance is generally recognized outside of the sphere of the means of production. Mandel has even talked about the survival of the, quote, bourgeois right of inheritance, end quote, in his Marxist Economic Theory, Volume 2, but this is not correct. Inheritance rights are also found in feudal and slave societies. End footnote. The capitalist solution, which is the one preferred by the bureaucrats, would destroy the bureaucracy as the dominant class, yet to the bureaucracy this solution appears the lesser evil, since in a capitalist society they would survive as a relatively privileged caste at the service of the dominant class. Moreover, it is always possible for the bureaucrats to go over to the victor's side, as happened with certain feudal lords during the ascent of the bourgeoisie, and thus preserve their privileges that a socialist solution would destroy. This is reinforced by the fact that in both the bureaucracy and in the technocracy there are a series of uncertain and fluctuating elements, e.g. managers who are party functionaries such as Kosygin. These elements footnote. It has been pointed out that Kosygin has in the past taken pro-reformist positions. During the Prague developments, the government newspaper run by Kosygin took a more moderate attitude than Pravda. End footnote. These elements objectively seek compromises, a reflection of their hybrid social position, and occasionally succeed. The 1965 to 66 reforms can be seen as a compromise very much along these lines. These compromises cannot freeze history, yet they break open a fixed situation, thus opening the way for overcoming the very compromises. The year 1965 marks the maturation of the contradictions and the fractures of the bureaucratic plan. From 1956 to 1965, the Soviet economy was an experimental laboratory seeking to eliminate its internal fractures. After 1961, the year that signaled the first important setback of the Soviet economy as a whole, polemics were added to the experiments, which this time did not tend to modernize the system, but rather to modify it in the Yugoslav direction. The problem began in 1956 when workers were no longer required to work for the enterprise to which they were assigned. This reintroduced the phenomenon of labor mobility. In 1957, Khrushchev's decentralization reforms gave some important powers to newly constructed peripheral organs, the Sovnarkozy, which nominated and recalled top managers of enterprises. The centralized ministries that had controlled the economic activity of the various branches were largely abolished. This was seen as a return of the law of value as the leading element of the economy. But such a law can only operate in small mercantile production and in capitalism, but not within a planned economy. Capitalism certainly was not restored in Russia in 1957. Enterprises remained fully subordinated to the plan. At the beginning of 1965, the plan still specified 30 or 40 binding rules for enterprises. Moreover, the reform did not restore the profit principle, which is necessary for the working of the law of value in a capitalist mercantile system. In fact, in 1962, Lieberman and the company fought to have profits admitted as the guiding element of Soviet enterprises. The meaning of the 1957 reforms is something else: to expand the base of bureaucratic power and to better control individual enterprises. Like the old centralized ministries, the Sovnarkozy, the principal innovation of the reform, were still organs of the Soviet state. Their main duty was to make sure that the plan, always decided by various state organs, was followed, and to nominate and recall the managers of enterprises. Footnote. No footnote, never mind. This is considerable power, but it did not touch the central and dominant character of the plan. It brought controls closer to the managers through organs that, although peripheral, were always state bureaucratic. Thus, the bureaucracy's lower strata were given prestige, and their commitment to the system strengthened. It was not by accident that the reform came after 1956, when the high-level bureaucrats had to face the problem of the size of their own base. In 1958, pseudo-democratic organs were created in the factories for obvious propaganda aims, and in 1961, there was a formal recognition of the right of management in the enterprises. This right, however, had no real content since the plan remained dominant. It was therefore necessary for those seeking autonomy for the enterprises to come out into the open and formulate their explicit demands. In 1962, there was a partial re-centralization, above all a reduction in the number of Sovnarkozy in response to economic problems. In 1962, however, this is also the year of the Lieberman debate. After 1960, the obviously evident failure of the past... After the 1968, the obviously evident failure of the 7-year plan and the masses' dissatisfaction permitted the, quote, autonomists, end quote, to come into the open in 1962 with Lieberman's famous article, whose demands sought to develop planned market relations openly in favor of the market, business autonomy, profit, self-financing, material incentives, and price flexibility, largely influenced by the market. Footnote. Lieberman and others. Lieberman's themes are subsequently taken up by other economists such as Trapezukov and Namensinov, Berman, etc. End footnote. The direction of the proposed reforms is clear. They follow Bruss's scheme. The profit principle signals a complete reversal with respect to the old plan, where profits were a mere bookkeeping device. It was neither a measure of an enterprise's success, nor a function of distribution, nor did products necessarily have to be sold on the market. Hitherto, the plan and not profit had been the mainspring of the economy. The enterprise had to realize the plan, even at a loss, and if there was a surplus product, it went to the economy in its entirety, except for a small part that remained with the enterprise, the so-called director's fund. All of this was done through the mediation of the plan and not the market. The basic principle is that what was good for the plan was good for the enterprise. Lieberman reversed the principle. What was good for the enterprise would also be good for the plan. Collective utility was to be realized through competition. Thus, after 35 years of Stalinist planning, there was to be a return to Adam Smith. Footnote. Lieberman's attempt at defense for internal or external use, contained in a letter to The Economist, is interesting in that the Soviet economist notes that profit cannot be obtained by a single enterprise, and thus private capitals could not be formed. This, however, is false, since in the first article, Lieberman speaks about the gains, incentives, and the freedom of the enterprise to dispose of the incentive fund, capitalized profits, In substance, the enterprise acts according to the profit motive. It no longer aims at producing use values, but rather exchange values for the market in order to make profits, a large part of which will go to the enterprise provided with a lot of commercial autonomy. Thus, the logic of an economy that operates for profit and for exchange values will begin to work itself out, and in the long run it will determine the predominance of the market over the plan. This is obviously not explicitly stated by Lieberman, but is clearly implied. End footnote. It is not altogether unlikely that in the future there could be a complete restoration of private property on the legal formal level. But even if this does not happen, the implicit and explicit application of the Lieberman model would bring about a type of economy in which business would act according to capitalist principles, and managers would have the power of management and disposition of the goods and profits of the business similar to their Western colleagues. Among other things, managers would be able to take part of the profits as, quote, remuneration, end quote, thus enriching their private estate. Footnote. Obviously, these, quote, remunerations, end quote, can very well mask profits in the technical sense, an expression of surplus value and not surplus product, that the managers give themselves through a proper manipulation of the budget. In this regard, Soviet managers can take a lesson from Western managers. Their lapses show that they would be very good pupils. End footnote. This would be enough to turn the Soviet economy into one based on surplus value and on the exploitation of human labor to the advantage of a class, parenthesis, the managers, in parenthesis, who would practically live on this exploitation. On the whole, such a system would not substantially differ from capitalism. The only difference is that each manager on dying would leave the enterprise to another manager rather than to descendants. This, however, does not in the least affect the productive relations and its functioning. In 1964, after 2 years of discussion, the Lieberman reforms were tried out, seemingly with success in 2 establishments, and in 1965, after the failure of the 7-year plan, a series of reforms proposed by Kosygin were passed. They moved closer to Lieberman's direction, and therefore were politically different from those of 1957, which were inspired by principles of administrative decentralization. Footnote. Power is not partly transferred to peripheral state organs, the 1957 Sovnarkozy, but to the productive units, i.e. the managers. End footnote. It would be exaggerating to see in these reforms an integral restoration of capitalism as happened in Yugoslavia. In spite of everything, the plan remains at the center of the economy. The reform, however, openly recognizes some market principles whose coexistence with the plan is unstable and contradictory. Although the reformers have not won the war, they have won a major battle. Let us examine the main points of the reform. The rules imposed by the plan on industry were reduced from 30 or 40, and sometimes even more, to 8. They control the basic goods to be produced, capital investment of new plants to be built, production to be sold, the main tasks of new equipment, the technical material supply, the level of profits and of income, which payments are to be made by enterprises to the state budget and vice versa, and the total wage fund. Footnote. It should also be noted that the state does not give capital freely but asks for interest from enterprises. Even after the reforms, however, the state's power is enormous and leaves no doubt as to who is the boss. Interest, therefore, does not imply that the enterprise is now independent from the state. In the past, in fact, the free assignment of funds was a source of waste on the part of managers. Thus the state resorts to the mercantile category of interest to contain this waste and to make individual directors responsible for, quote, their, end quote, enterprises. Even the state agricultural Sovnarkozy now pay interest. End footnote. Prices remain generally fixed through the plan. An economy so controlled cannot be considered capitalist, since the principle of production for profit, if it occurs, is largely subordinated to the plan. Only when the market supplants the plan will profit really become the leading element of the economy, and one could therefore speak of capitalism. Yet the reforms remain significant, since the managers are given considerable power concerning the number of employees, the work rhythm, and the internal distribution of wages. The plan sets only the basic total wage fund. Moreover, this gives rise to the labor market, since the managers are no longer faced with restrictions regarding employment policies. And in 1956, labor mobility became possible once again, all of which gives rise to unemployment. Managers now set up work rhythm, and of course they tend to employ more, quote, productive, end quote, workers, laying off others, which makes this tendency fairly important. Footnote. Levi mentions that in 1967 committees for the employment of labor were set up. Symptomatic is the news of the Shanakino, a chemical factory in Tula province, laid off of 870 workers when it increased the wages and work rhythm of the others. The situation was cited by the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party as an example to be followed. Obviously, Soviet propaganda says that 870 laid-off workers were reabsorbed. Recently, however, a rather authoritative Soviet magazine let it slip out that, quote, almost, end quote, all the workers were reabsorbed, and that the workers expelled from the productive cycle met, quote, a series of difficulties, end quote, that slowed down their re-employment. This is important. In the past, the USSR was characterized by a type of unemployment where the workers would leave their place of work and look for a better job, certain that they would be taken on because of labor scarcity. The type of unemployment showed a need for, and not an excess of, labor. Now, however, workers find it hard to be reabsorbed. Unemployment tends to be structural. With the embryonic development of capitalist mechanisms, the delights of capitalism also reappear. End footnote. Self-financing was also allowed, and finally, products had to be sold, while before they had only to be produced. Thus, exchange assumes greater importance. Dobb claims that there has been no qualitative change in the Stalinist era concerning incentives. Footnote. Dobb's theory is summarized by Lisa Foa in Something in Italian. End footnote. In the Stalin period, however, incentives were tied to the realization of a plan whose objective had a global and centralized character. Now they are connected to the utility of the enterprise. Thus we have a further push towards production for egotistic business ends. Yet as long as the state controls the macroeconomic levers, investment, wages, production, prices, etc., there is no predominance of the market over the plan, and the profit principle remains subordinated to the plan. Clearly, however, if in order to make profits it will be necessary to depress the wage fund by laying off some less productive workers and taking on more efficient ones, a conflict will develop with the plan which establishes the wage fund. The same would happen for goods and goods produced for what the plan specifies as the, quote, commercial composition, end quote, or at least for the fundamental categories. Even if it is more convenient to produce other goods, it will be necessary to obey the plan. The same is true for new equipment specified by the plan and for prices which no business autonomy can change, e.g. through cartel agreements reached in order to increase prices and profits. Here the functioning of market mechanisms and production for profit is clearly subordinated to and hindered by the plan. The profit principle demands, if not the destruction of the plan, its subordination to the market. Thus the Kosygin reforms open a period of instability and social tensions. They shift already existing tensions to a qualitatively different level. New section. Section 2. The 1965 to 67 agricultural reforms. 1 second. Sorry. Stalin's death came at a time when the relations with the masses demanded a revision since tensions were becoming unbearable. Timid decentralizing, advances up to 1955 were followed after 1958 by measures in the opposite direction. The dissolution of the machine tractor stations, centralized organ, was only apparently a liberal measure since the MTS personnel were, trustworthy, state employees to be organically inserted into the kolkhoz. In reality, the measure tended to bring state control closer to the enterprise. At best, it was ambivalent. These strange zigzags in state-rural relations can be explained by the fact that the individualistic peasants interpreted each decentralizing concession too broadly, which necessitated the stiffening of the state and the continued seesaw. In 1958-62, centralized measures, however, brought on the strike of the countryside. Thus, in the 1965-67 period, the state had to bend the stick back the other way and give peasants some concessions similar to other industrial reforms. The first reform, package, was essentially social in character, e.g. it improved kolkhoz pensions. The only change of importance for us was a modification of the acquisition price from the countryside. Although it did not establish free market prices, it did meet in part the desire of peasants to reduce, and in perspective to eliminate, the difference between the state prices and free, or kolkhoz market prices. The intensification of the mercantile tendencies became clearer in the second phase of the Brezhnev reforms of 1966 to 1967, when it was decided on an experimental basis to run 390 sovkhoz, completely statized enterprises, according to the profit principle, as with post-reform industry, and that part of the profits could be reused for self-financing. Thus, the number of indices was reduced, and the number of employees was no longer fixed by the plan, although the total wage fund as an industry did remain fixed. Furthermore, some kolkhozs were allowed to experiment with zemstvos, where the cultivation of a part of the land would be entrusted to some families who would also keep a large part of its product, presumably to be sold on the free kolkhoz market. Clearly, this is still quite far away from the privatization of agriculture as formulated by Professor Venier, who talks of, socialist, mercantile production. As with industry, here the principle of mercantile profit is subordinated to the plan, even if less advanced than in industry. Here too we discern a distinct tendency for centrally directed bureaucratic collective relations to rapidly degenerate. New section. Section 3. USSR reforms, preliminary evaluations, and perspectives. Initial results of the Brezhnev-Kosygin reforms were positive. They freed some productive forces. The 1966 increase in agricultural prices and the rather timid beginning of a movement toward privatization provided some incentive to increase production. In industry, the acceptance of some of the managers' demands furthered the realization of the plan by partially relaxing their silent sabotage. Reforms provided the managers with the type of rationalization that they wanted. By maneuvering between the carrot of incentives and the stick of layoffs, which is no longer an illusory threat, they got the point across to the workers. The managers could lay off 3, lazy workers and take on 2, good workers by using the incentive of higher wages, given that they were now free to expand or restrict the number of employees. In 1968, however, the old tensions reemerged in all their severity. The 1965-67 reforms and the connected plan were only emergency measures which did not resolve structural problems. Thus, the old problem of productivity remains, and Soviet productivity is only about 70 to 80% of Italy's. The growing importance of the secondary sector poses the major problem of articulating production. As already indicated, this problem cannot be resolved within the framework of a system still relatively dominated by a central plan. It necessitates further shifts in the direction of a total, mercantilization, end quote, of the economy. Thus, the new consumer orientation must be reconsidered since, although a significant absolute increase in consumer production is foreseen for 1970, light industry still remains the poor cousin. In 1970, production in the primary sector is projected at 250 billion rubles against only 100 in the secondary sector. The primary sector should increase 51% with respect to 1965, while the secondary one 45%. If Bakov is correct, however, in 1969, Sector A was developed at a rate of 6.1% per year against 6.8% for Sector B. Thus, we would have the first very timid beginnings of the inversion of the direction. The difference, however, remains enormous, and the predominance of Sector A is obvious. What is relevant is that even this modest inversion was possible only by beginning to dismantle the old system and moving in a capitalist direction. Moreover, the quote consumerist orientation objectively retards the developing of a solution to the problem of technological modernization of Soviet production. The latter, in fact, requires a strong effort in the primary sector. Such an effort today is impossible since it would create unbearable social tensions. Thus, it was decided to increase consumer production, thereby leaving the productive apparatus in a state of retardation, which will hinder the development of labor productivity. Whichever solution is chosen, it can only deal with the immediate situation. In the long run, the problem remains. It could be partially resolved by intensifying trade with the West, buying what Russia has difficulty in producing. It is interesting to notice some tendencies in Soviet foreign trade. In the past, this was never too important to the Russian economy. There was clearly a tendency to increase trade with the West. In 1950, this trade was 19% of total Soviet trade. In 1960, it was 28%. From 1961 to 1967, the percentage of trade with the West in the balance of payments of Eastern countries reached 38%. After 1965, the consumerist turn increased this tendency, and two events assumed a great importance: agreements with Fiat and Japanese businesses and the development of a merchant marine. Footnote: see Saloni, Les Russes sur mer. This phenomenon already existed in 1945, but in the last years in particular, in the reformist and pre-reformist era, it has become much more important with the large orders at the Polish and Japanese docks. On the recent agreements with Japanese business, see Jali, Imperialism in the 70s, which refers to other important business agreements between the USSR and large Western monopolies. On the Fiat matter, see Tsukuoto. And footnote. The laws of the capitalist market, however, demand conformity with those who operate within it. As long as trade with the West was insignificant, there were no great problems. Footnote: see, for example, Marx Grundrisse, where he writes, quote, "The tendency to create the world market is directly given in the concept of capital itself. Every limit appears as a barrier to be overcome, initially to subjugate every movement of production itself, to exchange and to suspend the production of direct use values not entering into exchange, i.e. precisely to posit production based on capital in place of earlier modes of production which appear primitive, naturwissig. From its standpoint, commerce no longer appears here as a function taking place between independent productions for the exchange of their excess, but rather as essentially all-embracing presupposition and moment of production itself," end quote. See also, end quote, Marx, Grundrisse. See also Preobrazhensky, The New Economics, end footnote. As long as trade with the West was insignificant, there were no great problems. But as this trade increases and presumably becomes necessary, it is easy to imagine how the conditioning of world markets would compound the pool of internal mercantile economic principles. The increase in trade is still modest. This is explained by the continued poor quality of Russian products that fail to attract Western buyers, and by the fact that Russia needs its raw materials and cannot greatly expand this type of export. In time, however, the new situation will deteriorate, thus allowing the, quote, liberals to make additional demands. The recent Lieberman-Syttnen debate, Syttnen being a conservative, concerning prices clarifies a lot. Lieberman wants prices to be decided by the market, which, as the scandalized Syttnen notes, would mean a return to capitalist anarchy. For the market to decide prices, it is necessary to have Western criteria, i.e. the logic of capitalism. What this means is that the technocracy has not renounced its idea of transferring economic power from plan to the enterprises. This implies the expropriation of the bureaucracy by the technocracy. In the present system, prices are a tool of the plan and operate independently of market mechanisms. To wrestle this from the bureaucracy would practically amount to taking away from it the control of the economy. To use a military comparison, the Russian plan still occupies the dominant heights of the economy, but is completely surrounded by stronger market mechanisms. This state of affairs is not a result of market mechanisms being dominant, but rather a consequence of the plan's inability to resolve the problems of the Russian economy. The situation is further complicated by the countryside's continual strikes after the brief 1966 relaxation. According to the Soviet agency Novosti, the plan sets up the pace in the countryside. The quote, mercantilization, end quote, tendencies of 1965 to 66, although real, were considered too weak, and they failed to re-establish the predominance of the market over the plan, as the Russian peasants wished. Was there poor mechanization of agriculture? Without doubt, but it would be too easy to reduce a political problem to a technological problem. The labor productivity in the kolkhoz plots proves that work can be done effectively with respect to productivity in collectivized enterprises, even without a huge technical apparatus. If the farmers gave the kolkhoz the same attention they gave to their own plots, Russian agricultural production would not have increased only 28% in 8 years. Thus, even the countryside continues to reject the present Soviet productive system. Footnote. No footnote. Where am I? Thus, even the countryside continues to reject the present Soviet productive system. After 1968, Russian agriculture deteriorated. In addition to climatic problems, the basic dysfunctions remained. If we take into account these years' experiments and continued adjustments meant to cure the, quote, great sickness, end quote, of the Russian economy, and the modest base from which it took off in 1960, we have a totally distressing picture. The brief state countryside, quote, flirtation, end quote, of 1966, helped along by the euphoria created by the modest 1965 to 66 reforms, had already worn out by 1967 and is now a faraway memory. The problems are now all in the open, and we cannot see how the bureaucracy can resolve them. Whatever road Soviet society takes, restoration of capitalism or socialist revolution, the bureaucracy as a class is due to go. New section, section 4, a general proof, Czechoslovakia. Before drawing definite conclusions, we cannot avoid examining the decay of bureaucratic collective regimes in Eastern Europe, e.g. the Czech developments. Clearly, the decaying process in question is not only hitting Russia, but also East European countries, where the Soviet system was transplanted by the Red Army, with Yugoslavia being the only exception. The foreign installation of a bureaucratic collectivist system and the consequent political and economic vassalage, Comecon, of the local bureaucracy to Moscow explains the extreme fragility of these regimes. Even with respect to the Soviet model, a separation from the mass is even greater than in Russia, and their vulnerability to nationalist propaganda. Moreover, unlike Russia, most of these countries do not have the enormous reserve of raw material and workers on whose extensive exploitation Russian economic developments has been based. Of these countries, Czechoslovakia is the least adaptable to a bureaucratic collectivist system, since Czechoslovakia was already an industrialized and, quote, westernized country. Undoubtedly, war destruction contributed to the earlier development of a plan adapted to the needs of economic recovery. A war-devastated industrialized country presents recovery problems somewhat similar to those of underdeveloped countries. Footnote. On this, see Zalewski. This author, a pro-reformist, notes that with the end of Reconstruction in 1953, the Bohemian economy let loose some reserves which it allowed to develop until 1958, when the implications started to catch up with the reality and were to explode some years later, first with a series of reforms, and then with the new course in Soviet occupation. In effect, the contradictions of the system surfaced after only a dozen years, much sooner than in Russia. End footnote. The huge political strength of the Czech Communist Party, which controlled about 40% of the electorate, allowed the solution to be less, quote, foreign, end quote, here than in Poland or Romania, by temporarily giving the regime a mass base. This mass base permitted the system to come out of the 1956 tempest unharmed. But when the crisis did come, it was more serious than in Hungary and Poland. In these still underdeveloped countries, the system had its margin of survival, even after the 1956 crisis. Since, however, Czechoslovakia was a modern and industrialized country, the crisis expressed a situation where the development of productive forces entered into incurable conflict with the maintenance of bureaucratic collectivist relations. In other words, the 1956 crises in Poland and Hungary were largely due to conjunctural factors. For example, the enormous ferment generated by Khrushchev's report in the two countries where the regimes were most authoritarian and disliked by the masses. In Czechoslovakia, however, the main determinant was the complete decay of the bureaucratic plan. For example, during the 1958 to 63 period, the fall in the rate of income increase is generally greater in Czechoslovakia than in the USSR. In 1963, income was 2.2% lower than in 1962, which in turn was only 1.4% higher than 1961. In fact, the middle of the 1960s, reforms had an explicitly mercantile character and were a response to the plan's increasingly unbearable dysfunctions, waste, poor quality goods, low labor productivity, and little development of consumer goods. Lacking a proletarian revolutionary response, direction could only pass over to Otto Sieck and the supporters of, quote, market socialism, end quote. The need to reinforce the economic reforms footnote. See Salucky, where we read, quote, "It is not by accident that the whole history of humanity up till today confirms that the basis of civil society is the market economy that excludes the violent, i.e., anti-economic constraint of working people towards output. This renders it impossible for the basis of human relations to become hierarchical within the context of the entire state. As soon as the market mechanism is weakened and dominated and eliminated, there necessarily comes into economic life subjectivism, administrative methods, bureaucratic maneuvering, and authoritarian decision-making procedures for the criteria of disinterested measurement, which is the market artificially established indicators must be substituted, ... end quote. This revealing passage shows the ideological exaltation of the market as the very basis of civil society without any class analysis of this, quote, neutral instrument that underlies production. End footnote. The need to reinforce the economic reforms, which were being sabotaged by the bureaucracy, mandated the January, quote, revolution and the fall of the Novotny regime. Wikipedia says, Antonin Joseph Novotny lived from 1904 to 1975 and was Czechoslovak president, who served as the president of Czechoslovakia from 1957 to 1968, and as first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia from 1953 to 1968. An ardent hardliner, Novotny was forced to yield the reins of power to Alexander Dubček during the short-lived reform movement of 1968. Back to the text. Nothing further opposed itself to the realization of a human socialism, i.e. the socialism of a man who goes to the market! Exclamation point. The Russian intervention must be understood in this framework. It sought to crush in Prague forces similar to those in Moscow. They hit sick because they understood Liberman. This can be seen more clearly if one takes into account that just at this time an offensive was unleashed by the bureaucracy to block the gradual application of the reforms with some immediate successes. Footnote. On the new course in the 1968 event, see Bonsignori, Neri, Baldelli, Tilgrid, Macchio, Sweezy, Czechoslovakia, Capitalism and Socialism, Huberman, A Disaster, Monthly Review, Page, Otto Sick and Czechoslovakia and Socialism, Bartosik, Klein, Kosick, Richter, Taiga, on Czechoslovakia, Klein, and Footnote. Sorry, there's a lot of articles and books with titles that were in Italian or French or something else. New section, Section 5. The forces involved. In such a complex situation, it is not appropriate to prophesize, yet historical materialism must allow some probable scientific forecasts. The restoration of capitalism is not a linear process, but a dialectical process led by two main social forces, the bureaucracy and the managers. We have already discussed the class nature of the bureaucracy. The managers also fit the concept of class for itself in the Marxist sense. Footnote. In this we differ from the Chinese, who do not distinguish between these two groups. Tatu maintains that not all managers are reformists. Even if this were true, it is beyond question that this vanguard responds to the objective interest of the group that has shown considerable ability to press their demands. Certainly there are ambiguous, centrist, and uncertain elements, but this is normal in social struggles. End footnote. We already discussed the class nature of the bureaucracy. The managers also fit the concept of class for itself in the Marxist sense. This social group has its own interests within productive relations, and they tend towards the restoration of capitalism. The struggles and polemics of these last years also show that they are aware of this fact. They do not have their own party, but by and large belong to the Communist Party of the USSR. Many of them, in fact, have a political background. Thus, it is not hazardous to consider them as a current in the party, from which they won some concessions in 1965. They are also organized around, quote, liberal economic and literary journals. Let us now look at those forces that the two contenders must consider. A. The bureaucratic military apparatus. Although some members of the, quote, liberal and, quote, wing of the military hold interesting positions, there is no doubt that on the whole, the higher levels of the army are part of the party-state bureaucracy of which they constitute a sector. The military bureaucracy's interests do not coincide with the managers. In fact, the politics of consumption and of easing of tensions forced a temporary reduction in military spending and, therefore, of the general's political importance. The position taken by the Army's journal Red Star in the cultural debate among the youth is clear. It followed a traditional Stalinism that certainly could not favorably consider the manager's ideas. The Czech invasion could not have been pulled off so smoothly without the support of the high military bureaucracy, and we have seen socially that what the invasion implied. Finally, without the support of the army, i.e. its highest levels, the bureaucracy would have been destroyed some time ago. Instead, as it is isolated as it is from the rest of the country. B. The world of peasants. As we have seen, they seek the restoration of capitalism. C. Intellectuals and students. This group is divided into various currents. Some are neo-Stalinists, Siolkov and Kosatov. Others seem to be Leninists or Trotskyists, ? And finally, there are others, the largest group, who are, quote, liberals, and express on the cultural level the same demands the managers express on the political level. This latter group has succeeded in gaining the sympathy of most students. One need only look at the attitude of the Czech youth, which is related to their Russian contemporaries, toward Dubček, whom they consider to be utopian because of his internationalism and his anti-mercantilism. In addition, in spite of police repression in the last years, there has been a proliferation of clandestine university youth journals expressing decadent and petty bourgeois positions. Many of these people probably believe that they are socialists and hope in Russia, as in Czechoslovakia, to reconcile socialism, the market, and bourgeois individualism. This is an understandable reaction to the economic and human failure of bureaucratic collectivism, which is often identified by intellectuals as a form of partial and distorted socialism. Moreover, even in the West, quote, Marxist, end quote, intellectuals have in good faith identified Yugoslavia as the, quote, correct, end quote, synthesis of socialism, the market, and individualism. Given the failure of the Soviet model, the attitude of the Yugoslav youth, however, was quite different than when in 1968 they entered an unprecedented revolt. But this can be partly explained by the fact that in Yugoslavia, the process of transition towards capitalism began earlier and was generally completed by 1965 with the last economic reforms. Thus, it is no accident that the youth of Belgrade and Zagreb took on the, quote, new red bourgeoisie, end quote, nor that the youth of Prague took on Novotny and the old bureaucracy, which in Russia had its equivalent in Brezhnev, etc. Footnote. On the youth revolt in its nature, see Plamenik, and Delboka, and Perelman. End footnote. Nor that the youth of Prague took on Novotny in Prague, reforms were in their initial phase and could be realized only minimally because of the bureaucracy's opposition to their execution, even when they were formally passed. In Belgrade, the restoration of capitalism was accomplished, and one could see the, quote, positive, end quote, results of the reforms: unemployment, strikes, growing social inequality, the persistence of cultural authoritarianism, etc. D. The working class. This force is the largest unknown in the situation, and in the end is the decisive force because of its numerical, economic, and cultural importance. The Soviet workers have no reason for remaining faithful to a bureaucratic system that has given them low wages, no democracy, bureaucratic unions, and very low quality consumer goods. The very low labor productivity is largely due to their alienation from the system. It does not follow, however, that the working class is on the manager's side. If the 1965 reforms initially raised any hopes, they soon showed their true social significance when they were fully carried out. Although their realization was hindered by the bureaucracy, the power to distribute incentive funds was given to managers and to the discredited union committees, with the result that they took the lion's share while the workers ended up with the crumbs. Footnote. See the data cited by Levi, where on the basis of Russian statistics, Levi notes that only 15% of the incentive funds went to workers, who are very many, as opposed to 48% that went to managers, who are very few. The fears of those who thought that the reforms could open the road to profits, see Coletti and Lisa Foa, were confirmed. End footnote. Moreover, the broad powers given to managers have recreated the specter of unemployment and have given the managers a blackmail weapon with which to increase the work rhythm. If the youth intellectuals and the groups extraneous to the relations of production can still have illusions about the reforms, this is not true for the Russian workers who have the reforms worked out on their backs and who know the real class nature of the, quote, new economics, end quote. The most probable attitude of the working class will be one of neutrality, at least if there is no rapid revolutionary development on a world scale. The end. Thanks for listening. That's the end of the entire piece by Antonio Carlo titled The Socio-Economic Nature of the USSR. Thank you for listening.